Section 4, so the last section in the biology curriculum. The beginning, state that the sun is the principal source of energy input into biological systems. Not really much else to say. The sun is where all our energy starts. So if we look at you don't see it in a food chain, but in any energy system, the sun is where the energy originally comes from. Okay, it gets into our energy system through thermal transfer or through photosynthesis. All right. Now, unlike the other cycles, the energy, it doesn't go in a cycle. It doesn't go in a circle. It doesn't come back to its original point in a biological cycle, okay? So energy comes from the sun, and then it starts to get lost immediately. There's less and less and less through each stage of the cycle. So let's go to this guy. And the energy systems that we watch our cycles in, we'll call them food chains, all right? So food chain is a chart showing the flow of energy, and these definitions, of just like everything else, came straight out of the syllabus. So a food chain is a chart that shows the flow of energy from one organism to the next. So the food chain is showing who eats who. A food web is a network of food chains that interconnect in some way, shape, or form. Producers make their own nutrients. Well, technically they just make the sugar. Consumers, they feed on other organisms. Herbivores only eat plants to get energy. Carnivores only gets energy from eating other organisms. And a decomposer gets its energy from dead waste or organic matter. Okay, and then there's a few more definitions: ecosystem, trophic level, and there should be, in all honesty, we should have one on population too. Oh, there is one on population. It's in the next section. So now we start talking about cycles. So this would be your typical food chain, okay? So energy comes from the sun and goes into, in a marine food chain, it'll be phytoplankton. In a land or terrestrial food chain, it'll be a plant. That plant makes sugars via photosynthesis. Primary consumer will eat the primary producer, and then secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. So of course that just goes up 10, 20, 30, 40, okay? If you don't know how to spell secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. So as we go up, there is less energy available. So let's pretend a plant has 100% of energy. When the herbivore eats it, it can only get 10% of what was that 100% because the plant spends 90. And then this guy has 10%, and he will spend 90% of his as well. So this carnivore would only get 1. And this is why you can only get so many stages or trophic levels in a food chain, because each level is losing 90%. So you can only get so high before you have 0. All right. Now a food web is just a bunch of food chains that are connected. So in this web, one food chain is plant, mouse, snake, kite. Another food chain is plant, mouse, owl. Another food chain is plant, mouse. Why would a rabbit eat a mouse? That's creepy. Rabbit, wildcat, lion. Rabbits don't eat mice. That is creepy. All right, so as you can see, there's a bunch of different food chains. Now, we can show what a food chain looks like based on a pyramid, but the problem with pyramids is each one shows something different, and not every pyramid tells a precise story. So let's look at pyramids of numbers first. Let's say there are a lot of clovers, so 1,000,000 clovers are eaten by 100 snails, and then the thrush eats like 10 snails, so there's only like 10 thrushes, and then there would be 1 sparrowhawk. Alright, now the problem with the pyramid of numbers is that it does not take into account size. In this situation, there's only 1 oak tree, but that one oak tree could have 1,000,000 insects. So the pyramid of numbers isn't the best for showing what's going on. Another example, lots of grass is eaten by very few rabbits, but those rabbits have lots of fleas, so this pyramid just does not look right. So a way to get over the pyramid of numbers not looking right, because it does not take size into account, is to try a pyramid of mass. So a pyramid of mass tells you, the mass, how much dry material is there. So pyramid of mass fixes a pyramid of numbers. If it was numbers, it would show this one tree to 1,000 caterpillars, 100 birds, 10 sparrowhawks. But when you go for mass, it shows it back as a regular pyramid. The problem with these is that they do not show growth. So this oak tree, once upon a time, was a lot smaller, and or in a few years it'll be a lot bigger. Or if you take something that grows a lot faster, let's say like algae could be 0 during the winter, but then 1,000,000 during the summer. So pyramid of mass does not take into consideration the growth of what's going on. So the most quote-unquote accurate one is the pyramid of energy, and that looks at energy trapped at a particular time. Okay? So it's a snapshot based on what's available. And when you look at that, then you can see perfectly the non-cyclical nature of energy. 1,000 kilocalories of energy in the producers, and then 10%, 10%, 10%. If we were to eat owls, we would only have 1 kilocal. Actually, we have 0.1 kilocal available. So that's why it kind of makes sense to be vegetarians. If we were to just eat vegetables or producers, there would be more energy available because none is lost. By the time we get to this tertiary consumer, so much of the energy has been spent that we've wasted a lot of the time. So again, mass versus number. I used omelets and eggs. 3 omelets is made by 12 eggs, but if you look at it based on cartons, 3 omelets are based on 1 carton. Same idea. All right. Now, what is causing this 10% change? What is causing the next trophic level to only be able to take 10%? And that's because each level still has to do Mrs. Gran. All right. So characteristics of living things. So there's your Mrs. Gran. It's not in the right order, but the Mrs. Gran requires energy for respiration. Requires energy from respiration. Said that backwards. So even though I ate 100 joules worth of sandwiches, 90 of those joules is going to be used for this stuff. So if something eats me, it only gets, I probably shouldn't have world star open, it only gets 10%. Okay, so let's check this syllabus. Food chain, food web, producer, consumer, herbivore, carnivore, decomposer, trophic level, energy losses. You lose 90%, you only transfer 10%, bang bang. Why are they less than 5? We covered that. Now let's talk about efficiency in, no, none of those are there, hit pause. So just to elaborate on the efficiency thing, again, every stage drops how much energy is available. So an example from this site, if we have, let's say, a field of grass, that field of grass could feed 100 people, or it could feed 1 cow, which would only feed 10 people. So every time you add a step in between the source and what you're going to eat, you lose that much. So you lose 10%. If something ate the cows and we ate that, we would only be able to feed 1 person. All right, on to the fun stuff, the carbon and the water cycles. So let's find this. Let's start with the carbon cycle. The same amount of carbon that was on the planet, a gajillion billion years ago, is on the planet now, just in different forms. So we'll start with photosynthesis. the sunlight gets the plants to make a carbohydrate, and they turn that carbohydrate into CO2 and energy through a process called respiration. So respiration turns a carbohydrate into CO2. If we eat the plant, we also turn that carbohydrate into CO2 through respiration. If we die, or if the plant dies, decomposers or germs, they will turn the carbohydrate that was in the plant into CO2 through respiration. So that's three things that respire: plants, decomposers, and animals. If the carbohydrate in the plant isn't decomposed and it just gets fossilized, it turns into a fossil fuel under the right conditions. And because we're brilliant, what humans do is they take that fossil fuel and they'll burn it. We could also burn, just regular trees as well. That will turn the carbohydrate in the tree into CO2. Now, green plants, they pull the CO2 out of the air through a process called photosynthesis, and they turn that CO2 back into a carbohydrate. So the carbon cycle is circular. As you can see, it starts here and it goes up to CO2 and comes back down and starts again and just goes in a circle. Carbon cycle. So as you can see, there are 4 arrows pointing to CO2 and 1 arrow pointing away from CO2, which means if we chop down trees for any reason, we have less arrows pointing away from CO2, which means we're increasing how much CO2 stays in the air. Part 2, if we're dumb enough to chop down the trees to burn them, not only do we remove this arrow, the blue one, we've added another red one, more combustion. So there are some real issues with chopping down trees, period, and or chopping down trees to burn them. All right, so we move on to the water cycle. Just like the carbon cycle, the water cycle is circular, and what we find is, what we know is the same amount of water that was on the planet when it was created is on the planet now. The difference between the water cycle and the carbon cycle is the water changes into different states. Well, technically the carbon cycle goes into different states of matter too, so whoever made that point was wrong. But the water cycle always stays in the form of water. It's always H2O. In the carbon cycle, it's CO2, it's C6H12O6. Is that right? That sounds right. All right, so it's turning into different things. In the water cycle, it's always water. It's just water in different forms. Okay, so let's start with where it's accumulated. So leaks. Lakes, rivers, accumulation, where it builds up. And then what happens is it evaporates from wherever it's accumulated and it condenses into a cloud. When that cloud condenses too much, it gets too heavy to stay in cloud form and it falls back to Earth as precipitation. One more arrow in that one. If the water is leaving plants, we call that transpiration. It's the reason why rainforests have such a high humidity. All those plants are giving off water out of their stomata. Okay, so let's double check what we need to know about this water cycle. Nothing, it's just basic water cycle. Okie dokie. Alright, now the nitrogen cycle is a little bit more difficult. I wonder what the little girl who made this, I wonder what hers looks like. Ecosystems, nitrogen cycle. Is hers any easier? Yeah, hers is nice. Okay, so we're going to use hers. So let's start with nitrogen in the air. Now, nitrogen is very unreactive. Okay, it does not like to turn into anything else. It likes to stay just as it is. So it requires lots of energy or very special processes to turn it into something else. So we call this nitrogen fixation. It fixes it and makes it usable. One way nitrogen fixation happens is through lightning. That's some, that's not all of it. The second way is through bacteria in root nodules and also bacteria in soil. It's a common misconception that the bacteria is only in the root nodules. The bacteria is also just in the soil, okay? So the nitrogen dissolves in the rain and it gets rained on the plants, okay? And these plants and the bacteria in there turn the nitrogen into nitrates and nitrites. There is a more complicated one, but we're going to stick with the easy one. So it fixes the nitrogen and turns it into something usable. So nitrites, nitrates, and ammonia. Okay? Now plants are able to absorb nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia, and they do that, and they turn those nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia into proteins. And of course, the animals eat the proteins and use them. If and when the animal dies or the plants die, the decomposers will turn their bodies and their carcasses back into ammonia, which will turn it back into nitrates, which will then be absorbed. And that's pretty much how, compost and fertilizer works. Put all the dead plant bodies in there, bacteria breaks it down into ammonia and into nitrites. So the phases you need to know from the syllabus: microorganisms provide usable nitrogen substances by nitrogen fixation. So decomposing, breaking it down into smaller pieces, and then nitrogen fixation gets it to a point, so we'll call it nitrites and nitrates that the plants can use. Plants absorb and use these and turn it into proteins, we know that. And then we go through the food chain. Nitrogen moves through eating. And then decomposition turns it back into ammonia, which turns it back into nitrates. There is one more cheeky guy. There are some bacteria that will turn nitrates and ammonia back into nitrogen, and we call that denitrification. So nitrification is turning the ammonia into nitrate. Nitrogen fixing is doing the same process pretty much. And denitrification is turning the useful stuff into non-useful stuff. Nitrification and denitrification. All right. And that's the nitrogen cycle. Let's see what else she's got. Yeah, that's it. That's what she's got. Ooh, that one looks hard. Stick at this one, nice and easy. So nitrogen in the air turns into something usable through nitrogen fixing. And that something usable is nitrate, so ammonia. Ammonia into nitrate is called nitrification. Nitrate back into nitrogen is called denitrification. Make yourself a little table with some arrows and you should be fine. Onwards to population. So there's a definition for population. Have I put that in? No, because I'm lazy. So your definition of population is a group of organisms of one species living in the same area at the same time. So what are the factors that affect population growth? Birth and immigration increase your population size. Death and emigration decrease your population size. It's just common sense. All right, and what are some of the factors that encourage this? Not useful at all. So factors that encourage population increase: competition, predation, and disease. What that pretty much means: food and space. Is there anything there to eat you? And are you susceptible to disease in this place? Okay, so what are some of the causes behind human population growth? And the biggest ones are improved agriculture. We are better than ever at growing food quickly. Improve health with more clean water. We have less waterborne diseases, so people aren't dying from diarrhea as much. And then improve medicines, increase our birth rate, decrease our death rate, and people are just generally living longer than they used to. The downsides to population growth: we'll eventually run out of food on the planet. The sun can only provide so much energy. If there's more people that require energy than the sun's providing, bang. We're running out of room. I disagree with that one. We just got to learn how to live on the water. Energy needs and trash. The last two, I think, have to do with just lifestyle. You don't need a lot of energy if you were raised not to use a lot of energy, but hey. So we get through... let's talk about leg and log. So let's go back to this. It's a lot easier to see how populations are affected through something that grows and reproduces very quickly. So let's look at bacteria. They grow and reproduce very quickly. And what you have is a graph that looks like this, and it's the bacterial growth curve. In the beginning, you have what's called the lag phase, and the lag phase looks kind of flat because, well, if you have one bacteria, it converts to 2, converts to 4, converts to 16, converts to, it goes like that. So when the numbers are low enough, the lag phase doesn't show any difference. And then suddenly, as the numbers get big enough, you see this log phase, this exponential growth. And that's because 1,000 turned into 100,000, and 100,000 turned into 1,000,000, and 1,000,000. They're all doubling and tripling and all that jazz. And then this happens when there is plenty of food and plenty of room. Sooner than later, the bacteria die at the same rate that they're being made. Probably you run out of food. Okay? So you get this stationary phase, a nice flat line. And if the bacteria start to die faster than they're being made, boom, you get this log phase. All right, so there's a quick table or breakdown of the bacterial growth phases. I keep losing the mouse. Now, while we are not bacteria, in fact, we're more like viruses, we do have a downside to human growth or population growth, and that is pollution. Okay? This is a table and the breakdown of the sources and the effects of our basic pollutants. All right, so a nice quick table for you. And, the syllabus breaks it down very specifically about what you need to know about each one. Deforestation is one big one. Chopping down trees has its long list of problems and issues that it causes. The big one, of course, has to do with CO2 and greenhouse gases. So a quick look at some of the downsides to deforestation: loss of habitat, loss of plant species, soil erosion leads to leaching, so lack of roots in the soil leads to flooding and mudslides, and then of course the CO2 and a change in how the rainfall happens. With less transpiration means less rainfall. So yeah, if we chop down all the trees, or chop down too many trees, we are increasing what they are calling the greenhouse effect. And the way that works is the sun radiates heat energy to the planet absorbs some, and it radiates some back out. Our atmosphere allows some of that through, and it captures some more. And by capture, it means it absorbs it and re-emits it back down. So our greenhouse gases are accumulating, and they absorb and re-emit that radiation back down to us. Now, the greenhouse gases are necessary because they block a lot of the harmful radiation from reaching the planet. As you can see, if this was the harmful one, it blocks it. So we do need greenhouse gases. The problem is too much, it becomes this blanket that just absorbs heat and re-emits it right back to us. And an overall increase in temperature will change our weather patterns. It will change the shift of where what crops are grown. And the real issue is that if the weather patterns start to change, we will not be able to predict the weather. And once upon a time, many storms happened at sea. Now it could be many storms happen on land. So weather and extreme temperature shifts are the problem. So now we're into our basic list of pollutants and how they're caused. We did greenhouse gases. Now let's talk about acid rain. So acid rain is caused by the burning of nitrogen compounds and sulfur compounds. So the sulfur compounds come from just regular burning, and the nitrogen compounds tend to come from car emissions. Okay? And as these compounds get into the atmosphere, they are absorbed by rainwater, or they dissolve into the rainwater, and those compounds become acidic. Okay? And those acidic compounds are rained back onto the planet, where they cause their list of problems. So acid rain from burning fossil fuels, you get an addition of sulfuric compounds, and then car exhaust causes nitric compounds, which turn into nitric acid and sulfuric acid. Our ways to prevent them are right there. Flue gas desulfurization means it's kind of like filtering the smokestack. So you have smokestacks where you're burning the fossil fuels and you see the smoke coming out. Well, if you just wash that with water first, then it'll turn the sulfur compounds into acid rain inside of that, and you could at least use that acid for something else. Okay, the effects of acid rain and why it's a bad idea: lowers the pH of water and soil, so our water and our soil become more acidic. Once the acidic compounds get into the soil, it causes minerals to leach out, so they wash away. A big problem is that the soil becomes infertile, and also aluminium can wash into lakes and rivers, which is a fish poison. Basically, acid will kill plants and animals, and it can and will destroy buildings. Alright, so that's the acid rain. Water pollution by sewage and chemical waste, that's the next one. So, sewage and chemical waste, it links with the fertilizer and eutrophication from the earlier topic. Eutrophication is when nitrogen and phosphorus compounds end up in rivers and lakes, which causes the algae to bloom, die, and then it causes a burst in bacterial growth. Well, sewage does the same thing. You're adding nitrogen and bacteria straight into water sources. You get a sudden bacterial growth, which causes oxygen content to drop, and then everything else in the river and the lake dies. Acid rain, air pollution by sulfur dioxide, greenhouse gases, done. Global warming, global warming and methane. One of the major greenhouse gases that we have is methane. And the methane, believe it or not, is coming from the large amounts of cattle that we're raising to eat for beef. So these cows pass gas, they fart, and that methane ends up into the atmosphere where it just collects, and that is also a greenhouse gas, a rather effective one too. So we get back to the regular. Pesticides, while we use pesticides, they may not necessarily break down quickly, and they can accumulate in food chains, and we call that bioaccumulation. And is it in this? No. Bioaccumulation is when little drops build up into big drops, and I'll show you how. Okay, so let's say you wanted to kill algae on a beach. So you pour some poison in that kills the algae. Now each algae has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 little drops of poison in them. And 10 little drops is deadly to the algae, but it does nothing to you and me, so we can swim in the ocean fine. Then those shrimp go and eat 10 or 15 of that algae. So now they have like 100 drops of poison in them, and they're not going to die. It's not deadly to them yet. And then the fish goes and eats about 30 shrimp, so now he has like 300 drops of poison in him. And the seal goes and eats 10 fish a day, so he has like 3,000 drops of poison in him. And then the polar bear goes and eats a seal, and bang. Well, not a seal, but he eats a bunch of seals, and he has 3 million drops of poison, and he dies. So imagine if we got thrown into this food chain as well, and you fed it to a baby. That's where we have our problem. So bioaccumulation is when the concentration of a substance increases as you go up the food chain, and it's a contaminant. It'll build up in its liver and or in the fat, and that's the part that most animals like to eat, the livers and the fat. So there's your bioaccumulation, okay? What's next? Pollution due to nuclear fallout. That one is kind of weird actually, but let's look at it. So nuclear fallout, so just exactly what you're thinking. Radiation poisoning and cancer that accumulates in food chains and causes cancer in the top carnivores. Okay? So now we get on to conservation. No, we still have to do with plastics. Non-biodegradable means that when you bury it, it either does not or takes a very, 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 very long time to break down. And burning them causes even more problems. So that's just going to take up more space over the years. Even if you're using landfills, it's still taking up space. Hello. And that's space that will eventually run out, and that's assuming that it stays on land. If it ends up in the ocean, it causes even more problems. So we want to stick with things that are biodegradable. Oh, the last one. Conservation. Describe the need for the conservation of species in their habitat. feel like I have a slide on this. How did I not do the sewage thing? Sorry. Let's do sewage first. We can recycle water by recycling our sewage, and it has a very, I wouldn't say simple, but I guess it is a simple process. Step one is you take all the large pieces out, right? So you throw it through a filter or a screen. It takes out all the rock, the hard stuff. Then sewage has a lot of just sit there and wait situations. So you sit there and you allow it to, you let it sit there and you let it settle. Kind of like juice, all the big bits settle to the bottom. And then what you do with that is you pump air through it and you add bacteria to try and break down the sludge at the bottom. And you continue to do that, just let the stuff settle, pump some bacteria through, let them break down everything. And when you get to the end where you have a lot less of the solids at the bottom, you just bleach it to kill all the bacteria and pump it back into the ocean or the lake or whatever. At that point in time, it's pretty much clean. The bacteria broke things down from big to small. You got it small enough to be used by other organisms, and you just pump it back out once you bleach it and kill the bacteria. All right, now we talk about conservation. A big point about conservation is not about keeping things the way they are. Conservation is about helping things to survive and to manage ecosystems even though our environment is changing. So it's helping the koalas to survive despite the fact that humans have moved into the area. All right? So we want to conserve ecosystems and habitats because ecosystems provide us with services for treating waste. They help maintain the balance of life on the planet and the nutrient cycles. The habitat supports different organisms. We want as many organisms as possible because, in all honesty, we can use them in the future to fight diseases. If you start killing everything off because you don't think you need it, then one day when you realize you do need it, it won't be there. And other species have as much of a right to live here as we do. So killing them because we think we're more important is an absolute waste of time. So there are some ways that we can conserve ecosystems: national parks, marine parks, rescuing animals, growing endangered plants. So I think Bermuda's doing that now after the storm. Reducing habitat destruction, so instead of just chopping everything down, finding other ways to live cohesively and to try and reestablish things that have been destroyed. And of course, encouraging sustainable management and development and seed banks. So seed banks is where we store the seeds of different plant organisms so that if anything was to go wrong, like a hurricane or a volcano or anything like that, we have the seeds necessary to bring them back from the brink of extinction. We also need to manage resources, fossil fuels, nitrogen, things of that nature. Okay, so that's conservation. Let's see what else we got. So I found one book that breaks down conservation strategies. They have it as preservation, reclamation, and creation. So preservation is keeping stuff the same. Reclamation is turning damaged areas back into something that the ecosystem can use. And creation is starting from scratch. Okay, so maybe those three sound like a good way to start.